You are watching something dangerous unfold, not on a battlefield, but inside the United States Senate. Last week, 5 Republican senators crossed a line. They voted with Democrats, not to start a war, but to ask a simple question: who decides when America goes to war? For a brief moment, it looked like Congress remembered its role, the Constitution, the balance of power. Then the pressure came. Phone calls, public shaming, a president furious at the idea of limits. A week later, 2 votes flipped, not on policy, on procedure. And just like that, Donald Trump regained something far more powerful than a missile: unchecked authority. If this feels like inside baseball, stay with me, because what just happened over Venezuela is not about Venezuela. It's about how easily a democracy can look away, and why that should worry you. If you want clear, calm analysis in a loud world, subscribe now, because this story is only beginning. And the next turn is far more consequential. Underneath the headlines, there is a precise moment worth isolating: a procedural vote, a technical maneuver, a rule, not a law. The Senate was not deciding whether to go to war with Venezuela. It was deciding whether it even had the right to decide. The resolution was narrow. It did not block action. It did not defund the military. It simply asserted that if U.S. troops were sent into hostilities, Congress must authorize it. That principle is not radical. It is constitutional. And yet the administration treated it as an existential threat. Why? Because the surprise operation in Caracas changed the stakes, bombing radar installations, deploying American personnel on the ground, capturing Nicolas Maduro. Once those lines were crossed, the question was no longer hypothetical. It became immediate, personal, and politically explosive. The vote exposed a fault line, not between parties, but between institution and individual power. To understand how we got here, we need to step back, much further back. This struggle did not begin with Donald Trump. It is older, structural, built into the American system itself. The Constitution split war powers by design. President's command, Congress authorizes. That tension was meant to slow decisions, to force debate, to make war harder, not easier. But over time, speed replaced deliberation. Crisis replaced process. Each foreign operation set a precedent. Each precedent weakened the next barrier. Presidents learned something simple: if you move fast enough, Congress reacts too late. Lawmakers, in turn, adapted. They protested after the fact. They argued over definitions. They avoided the word war. Venezuela fits perfectly into this pattern. An operation described as limited, temporary, necessary, no declaration, no final vote, just enough force to change reality. Not enough clarity to trigger accountability. And once troops are involved, the logic shifts. The flag is raised, dissent becomes disloyalty. This is the cycle, and cycles only break under pressure, which brings us to the moment when this one nearly did. For a brief window, the system pushed back. 5 Republican senators broke ranks, not quietly, not accidentally. They voted to advance the War Powers Resolution. That vote mattered because it suggested momentum. Debate, a final reckoning on the Senate floor. For the White House, this was the danger point. If the resolution reached a final vote, the question would be unavoidable. Was what happened in Caracas a war? Bombing radar targets, deploying U.S. military members on the ground, capturing Nicolas Maduro, and removing him to the United States. These were not abstractions. They were acts of force. And force demands authorization. That is why the reaction was immediate, public, personal. The president lashed out, calling Republican senators ashamed, warning they should never be elected again. Behind the scenes, the tone was worse. Angry calls, raised voices, direct pressure. This was the inflection point, a test of whether institutional gravity still held. If this matters to you, pause here, share this. because moments like this rarely announce themselves twice. The reversal came fast, and it came through a loophole. That loophole is where the real story lives. What changed was not the law, it was the justification. Two senators, Josh Hawley and Todd Young, shifted their position, not because the facts disappeared, but because they were offered assurances. Not votes, not limits, words. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, became the bridge. He promised there were no U.S. troops on the ground in Venezuela. He promised none would be sent without notifying Congress. He put it in writing carefully, conditionally. If the president decided to introduce forces into major hostilities, he would seek authorization, circumstances permitting. This language matters. It does not bind action. It manages perception. Hawley accepted the assurance. Young called the effort what it had become, a communications exercise, because even if the Senate passed the resolution, a veto was inevitable, an override impossible. So they chose procedure over principle, and that choice triggered the second crisis. Not a vote on war, a vote to prevent a vote. That is how power avoids daylight. And why this moment did not end in debate. It ended in silence. Silence, however, still requires numbers. And this is where the machinery locked into place. The maneuver was procedural, technical, deliberately opaque, a point of order, a rule interpretation, a fast-track disqualification. The resolution would not die by argument. It would be buried by process. The vote was razor thin, 51-50. One man tipped the scale. Vice President J.D. Vance walked onto the Senate floor, not to debate Venezuela, not to defend war, but to break a tie. That image matters, because it captures the inversion, the executive branch deciding whether the legislative branch may even speak. 3 Republicans held their ground: Rand Paul, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski. They voted no. They lost. With that vote, the bipartisan effort ended. No final debate, no recorded position on war, just an outcome, and outcomes, once normalized, become precedent. The administration did not need to win the argument, only to prevent the question. That is how unchecked authority expands. Quietly, procedurally, irreversibly, and while Washington moved on, something else began to settle in. A cost that does not show up in vote counts. It shows up elsewhere. That cost lands far from the Senate floor. It lands with you. Because when war is hidden behind procedure, you are the last to be informed. You are told this is not a war, that no troops are on the ground, that notifications will come later, but facts have already moved. Bombs fell on Caracas. American personnel were deployed. A foreign leader, Nicolas Maduro, was captured and removed. These are not symbolic acts. They carry consequences. For soldiers who serve without a declared mission, for families who hear reassurances instead of clarity, and for citizens asked to trust but not to decide. When Congress steps back, the burden does not disappear. It shifts downward onto the military, onto the public, onto you. This is why Rand Paul called it a disservice, why he warned of an elaborate ruse. Because wars not named are wars not debated. If this unsettles you, it should. Stay engaged, ask harder questions, because silence is how endless wars begin, and the consequences never stay abstract for long. What happens next does not stay contained within Venezuela. Power never does. When the United States signals that force can be used without a final vote, without a clear definition of war, other actors take notes. Allies recalibrate, adversaries probe. If Congress will not assert itself here, why would it elsewhere? Military buildups invite counter-moves. Naval deployments trigger responses. Regional tensions harden into blocks. Venezuela is not isolated. It sits at the intersection of energy markets, migration flows, and geopolitical rivalry. An unchecked operation sends a message. That speed matters more than consent. that procedure can outrun accountability. And once that message is sent, it cannot be unsent. This is how limited actions scale, how one-off missions normalize, not through declarations, through repetition. The global system does not collapse overnight. It erodes decision by decision. And each time oversight weakens, the cost of restoring it rises, which leaves us facing the hardest question, not what happened, but what happens next. Because the future is no longer theoretical. It is already taking shape. The future now branches, not cleanly, but unmistakably. There are three paths ahead. The first is restraint. The administration honors its assurances. No escalation. Congress is notified. Debate returns, late but intact. This is the best-case scenario. Stability by choice, not by law. The second path is drift. Operations continue, incremental, justified as necessary, never large enough to force a vote. This is how power quietly consolidates. No single decision triggers alarm. Only accumulation does. The third path is rupture, an incident, a miscalculation, a response that demands force. At that point, the question of authorization becomes irrelevant. The reality on the ground decides first. History favors the middle path, drift, because systems tend to follow incentives, not ideals. And when Congress signals reluctance, executives fill the vacuum. This is not about one president or one country. It is about whether democratic systems can still slow themselves down. The answer will define more than Venezuela. It will define the limits of power itself. This is how democracies change, not with coups, not with tanks in the streets, but with votes that prevent other votes, with assurances that calm concerns, while leaving authority untouched. What happened over Venezuela is now precedent, a roadmap. If a president can deploy force, face resistance, apply pressure, and erase oversight through procedure, then the constraint is no longer constitutional. It is voluntary, and voluntary limits rarely survive moments of fear. This is not a partisan warning, it is a structural one. Today it is Donald Trump. Tomorrow it will be someone else. The question is whether Congress remembers its role before the next crisis arrives. Because once war becomes an executive habit, reversing it is nearly impossible. If this analysis helped you see the system more clearly, share it. Subscribe. Stay engaged. Understanding power is the first defense against its abuse. And the next story will test this one even further.